All right, so let's begin with our first round of the Executive Dialogue, Asia Shifts post COP30. I would like to start with energy and industry. So as this sector underpins progress across all others, following the recent COP30 negotiations in Belém in Brazil, so the world is looking for a concrete implementation. Can we start with Dr. Praveen, please, based on your intelligence on S&P Global's latest energy scenarios? Where does the world stand today, and most importantly, how aligned is Thailand with these global climate ambitions? Could you please?
Sure. Sawadee Krap. Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. First of all, I would like to congratulate PTT group of companies for putting together such a stellar event. The audience is very engaging, and we would like to, as S&P Global, we would like to thank you for having the opportunity to come here and present to you some of our information and insights. Now, before I go into the core presentation for today, I just want to spend a couple of slides just to introduce our organization. So, S&P Global Energy is one of the 5 children of S&P Global Group of companies. We are known in the market for the indices that we provide that companies use to transact. So the S&P 500, we have platforms which organizations use to study health of companies, such as mergers and acquisitions, divestitures. And then we have a mobility business that looks at electric vehicle trends, passenger vehicle trends, and of course our S&P 500 index. Energy is the only business of S&P Global that specifically looks at commodities. And we basically provide a lot of information on data, insights, as well as forecasting. Our clientele, our client organization primarily consists of international and national energy companies, trading organizations, financial institutions, as well as government regulators and bodies like that. Now, if I were to just say in a nutshell, the markets that we cover is what you see on the right, so about 13 commodities, and we disseminate the data in form of reports as well as forecasts as well as fundamentals data. Now with that, I would like to get into the crux of today's discussion, which is the Conference of Parties, the 30th Conference of Parties, which was held in Belém in Brazil. Now, this was a milestone event because it marked the 10-year anniversary since the Paris Climate Agreement was formed, where the decision was made that countries must come together to limit global temperature rise to less or equal to 1.5 degrees centigrade. There have been substantial number of meetings and discussions since. If you remember the COP28, which is 2 years ago, which was held in Dubai, that is when they did a global stock take for the first time, and it was realized that we are very far behind in terms of our ambition. So the COP30 was as such known as the COP of implementation or the COP of action, where countries would come together and they would have a plan. In the build-up to COP30, you had the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions, as we call it. A lot of countries will submit their NDCs. This is basically their commitment on how they will mitigate climate change. And you had the first round in 2015. 5 years later, there was a second round in 2020. And then for COP30, there was a third round submitted in the one we had last year. So every 5 years, they've been doing an NDC submission. Now, to me, there were 2 things which I would like to highlight from COP30. First is countries generally did not agree to a fossil fuel phase out. So countries are generally being very resilient towards fossil fuels. And when I say fossil fuels, I'm talking primarily about oil, coal, as well as natural gas. So they will continue to be in the nation building plan. And the second thing was that a lot of countries have ambitions, but action is where they are falling short. So the ambition gap, as we like to call. Now, if you see on the chart, there is a nice little progress bar there, which kind of shows how countries have been progressing towards COP30. It was not all bad though, because a lot of countries agreed that we need to really start building up on things like renewable energy capacity, as well as trying to decarbonize the power sector heavily. Now, what I want to say with the next slide here is this is where we explore how the world is doing when it comes to tackling climate change. Now, the first curve that I want you to look at is what we call as the net zero 2050. This is what the world needs to do if we need to have net zero truly by 2050. And if you see the data there, if you look at the TPED, or as we call it, total primary energy demand, which is the last row, you need to have a total primary energy demand declining by 18% versus where we are today. Okay? And the extent of fossil fuel has to be 15% of the total primary energy demand. Now, when I say fossil fuels, I'm talking again about oil, natural gas, and coal. Now, we cannot imagine fossil fuel declining to that kind of a level if you look at the way the world is today. And to put this into a little bit of context, to make it easier for you to understand, the last time you had this kind of a drop in consumption pattern was during COVID. Now, we know what a horrible period of time that was, when we had basically no vehicles on the roads, there were no passenger traffic, there were no flights, and generally economies were in slump. So we don't want that, and therefore, realistically, we don't think, S&P Global doesn't think that a net zero by 2050 will happen. Now, what I want to bring your attention towards is the orange line there, which we call as the CI base case. And that is where we actually see a total primary energy demand growth of 17%. And where 52% of that primary energy demand would be from fossil fuels. Okay, and that will lead to a temperature rise of 2.5 degrees. So that is what we are realistically looking at if we are looking at business as usual from today's point of view. Now, there are three other scenarios there which we call as adaptation, fracture, and renaissance. Now, renaissance is the closest we will get to that Paris Agreement. For that, you will need to see a significant change in how emerging markets as well as developing economies tackle climate change. And fracture is a world where if you see the world today, and it's not very different from what's happening today, which is you see a lot of geopolitical tension in the way that US is going about its business under President Trump, as well as China trying to go about on its path of decarbonization. So imagine the Chinese technology coming into Southeast Asia and essentially making EVs extremely cheap, and they are flooding the industry for that. And that is a world where we see fracture happening. Adaptation is a world where if every economy doesn't think about climate change, but they go about doing what they are doing and they continue to rely on fossil fuels, and that's where we see the temperature rising by more than 3 degrees Celsius. So a bit of a contrasting pathways for you to imagine about how we go about seeing how the world can evolve. Now, what about Thailand? So Thailand, I mentioned to you earlier about the Thailand nationally determined contributions. And the little diamonds that you see there is what we see Thailand has submitted. Now, from our point of view, we do not see in a BAU environment Thailand being able to achieve those NDCs. And you know, the earlier presenters alluded to how Thailand can go about, but some of the sectors that Thailand needs to heavily decarbonize is power, industry, as well as transport. But this is where I've overlaid Thailand's energy scenarios versus what you saw versus the rest of the globe, and the trajectories are very similar. The thumbs up here is that Thailand, unlike many other countries which failed to meet its NDC deadlines, was able to submit its NDCs well before COP. The downside, as I mentioned earlier, in our base case scenario, we do not expect Thailand to be on track to meet its target. Now, the last slide I want to present before we go to the next question is where we see Thailand in our base case environment. And this is how we see the decarbonization happening across Thailand. So if I could bring your attention to the middle chart, which is the base case, as you can see, as I was saying earlier, the power, industry, and transport sectors are the three sectors where Thailand has heavy potential to decarbonize. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Praveen, for that insightful session. As Dr. Praveen has highlighted, the carbon pricing alone won't get us to net zero. We need a combination of policy support and also technological adoption to overcome the residual cost of clean energy. And it is clear that while renewable costs are falling, Thailand still face a significant ambition gap, I would say. Bridging this gap in the power, industrial, and also transport sectors will be the defining challenge for Thailand for our energy transition in the coming decade. So now let's shift our attention to our next speaker, Mr. Wen Tan, who will show us how the private and the public sector and also the transportation industry are responding. So please show us how record-breaking investment and falling technology costs are actually accelerating the transition in Asia. So let's hear from Mr. Wen Tan from Bloomberg NNF.
Thank you, Lisa. So firstly, I'd just like to express a big thank you, and we are deeply honored to be invited today to share our views of energy transition. And big congratulations to PTT for hosting such a grand and successful event. I'll just jump right into the content now. Actually, heading into COP30, we had relatively tame expectations in terms of the progress that will be made. But by the end of that event, we were actually still a little bit let down in terms of the progress made in some of this agenda that you see on the screen here today. By the end of the event, the NDCs only covered about 60% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and the new 2035 emissions reduction target imply only very limited decarbonization. Now, we actually score the G20 decarbonization policies every year to kind of track their commitment level towards decarbonization and if there's any changes to their commitment levels. And you can see here that interestingly, in 2025, the scoring for the transport sector actually fell the most. And this is due to a few key developments. So in China, they have something called the vehicle scrap rate scheme, where consumers can trade in their old gasoline car for a new electric vehicle at a subsidized rate. Many provinces, or quite a few provinces, have started to cut back on that program already. In the US, the federal EV tax incentives actually expired in September, and in the EU, the regulators have started to ease their stringency on the fuel mandates for the automakers. So all of these key developments actually led to the transport scoring we have, road transport in particular, to fall a lot in 2025 versus 2024. Now, before I kind of express or share our views on what this means for the future of the transport sector in terms of electrification and in terms of emissions, I'll just quickly introduce our base case scenario for energy transition, which is what we call the economic transition scenario. We update this scenario every year, and this scenario is basically a modeling exercise where we kind of imagine energy transition to occur in a world where investment decisions are made are required to meet rising energy demand in the most cost-effective manner. So and this scenario only takes into account existing policies. It does not factor in or does not assume any new policies that can speed up energy transition. So this is sort of like a BAU scenario. And under the economic transition scenario, we actually expect road transport emissions to actually fall in the next few decades. And you can see here on the chart that road transport segment within the transport sector makes up the largest share of emissions, and then followed by aviation and shipping. However, most of the abatement will still come from road transport. Why is that so? What we are seeing on the ground is that the electric share of total vehicle sales is increasing across all vehicle types. Even for medium and heavy duty trucks, which typically it's harder to electrify due to energy density issues and the natural workloads of heavy and medium and heavy duty trucks, but it's still on an uptrend. And generally, as battery technology improves, the technological feasibility of electrifying trucks actually increases. On the other side, 2- and 3-wheelers and passenger cars are relatively easy to electrify. And moving ahead in the next several years, we expect the trend of electrification to continue. And a key reason for why we are so optimistic in terms of the electrification story is because lithium-ion battery pack prices have fallen significantly over the last several years. What we have observed is that when the cumulative deployment of batteries doubles, battery pack prices actually falls by 18%. And this is what we call the learning rate, which is 18%. There's a nuance here where as the market expands and becomes larger, there's more time elapsing between each doubling of the cumulative deployment, which would in turn slow down the year-on-year decrease in battery pack prices. But even then, the trend of battery prices trending lower will continue to persist, at least in the next several years, and that will actually lead to the cost of EVs falling and make it more economically attractive, at least as compared to gasoline and diesel cars. So that is the upfront cost for EVs, and in markets like China, the upfront cost of an electric vehicle is actually cheaper than a gasoline car of the same size, just flat out. And beyond the capex and beyond the upfront cost of the car, we also have to look at the operating costs, the running costs of using an EV. So here we are looking at the cost of charging an EV versus the cost of refueling with gasoline. And here you can see across the board, home charging and slow public charging is actually cheaper than refueling with gasoline. However, for public fast charging in Europe and the US, it's actually still more expensive than refueling with gasoline, but still we expect with larger investments into charging infrastructure, cost optimization and cost decreases can be achieved. But you can see that in markets like China, the upfront cost of EVs and the operating cost of EVs is actually lower than gasoline cars already. And this is not factoring in additional functions that an EV may have, for example, karaoke systems or like seat warmers and that kind of stuff. So even in the absence of policy support, we expect that at least in the passenger car segments and a few other key segments that are easy to electrify, the trend of electrification will still continue to persist. Just a quick point about emissions. So EVs in general achieve significant emission reductions as compared to a gasoline car or internal combustion engine car, just setting the record straight. Now, onto aviation. So one of the key pillars towards decarbonizing the aviation sector is actually through the use of sustainable aviation fuel. So here you can see that going up to 2050, the levelized cost of producing sustainable aviation fuel will actually continue to be much higher than fossil jet fuel. And this is not considering the fact that under the hydroprocessing pathway, which is one of the cheapest ways of producing SAF today, the producers will very likely run into feedstock supply bottlenecks, which will force them to adopt other more expensive pathways that would drive costs even higher. However, with that being said, because a lot of countries today, they have SAF blending mandates and they are starting from a very low percentage, let's say 1%, it is very easy for producers to pass on the cost to consumers because that 1% actually has very low, even if you double the 1% in cost embedded into the jet fuel, the overall cost of the fuel is actually not a lot. But if you start to scale up to 10% to 20%, it becomes a lot harder to pass on the cost to consumers, right? Because the overall fuel cost will actually be more sensitive to any increases in the SAF cost embedded within that. So for aviation or for SAF, without policy support, it's very difficult to decarbonize. The same narrative can be said for the maritime sector. So ammonia and e-methanol fueled ships will very unlikely be cost competitive with oil fuel ships in the absence of carbon price. And just to give you an idea of how big the difference, the cost disparity is. So in 2040, we estimate that the carbon price has to be about $400 per metric ton for an ammonia fueled ship to reach cost parity with a fuel oil ship. So that's pretty significant. So just to sum up some of the key points here, electrification will continue despite stagnant or even diminishing policy support for the road transport segment. But for aviation and for maritime sector, if we want to achieve meaningful decarbonization, very significant policy support is still needed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wayne, for that reality check. It is clear that while the international policy stage at COP30 was a little bit disappointing, a bit of a letdown. The economic case for renewables and EVs remains unstoppable due to the falling costs that Mr. Wayne just presented to us. Thank you so much for your expertise. So now, from that we've seen a massive flow of capital into the energy and EVs, another critical piece of the sustainability puzzle lies in how we manage our land and feed to the world. So Mr. Nicholas, Dennis would like to get your perspective on the progress we're seeing in land use post-COP30. Could you please?
Thank you, Lisa. First of all, thanks to PDT for this invitation, and thanks for putting land use and agriculture on the agenda. This is actually also a very important piece of the equation. So COP30 happened in Brazil, and Brazil happened to be one of the powerhouse for agriculture. This is one of the 7 or 8 bread baskets we have to feed the world. So there was actually a lot of expectation that came, when COP30 started, right? Because this would be a chance to put agriculture and food security back into the COP process. And this would recognize not only that agriculture is an important source of the emissions today, right, in the climate equation, but also that it's probably one of the sectors that already faces very early on some of the issues, right? We actually see a lot of impact already of climate change to agriculture. Farmers actually signal that. So it started with some positive signal. There was, for instance, the Belém Declaration for Hunger, Poverty, and Human-Centered Climate Action that actually, for the first time in the COP process, was actually putting together the concept of food security and the concept of climate action. Right. So that was actually used to be 2 debates, and these were brought into one single debate. Now, before I go then to how we ended the COP, let me actually come back on why we think agriculture is an important element into this debate. So first of all, globally, it represents 20% roughly of the global emission. And if you basically look at what are the sources of those emissions, part of that, 70% or so of those emissions can be explained into 3 big groups. There is a livestock production per se, and where manure and enteric fermentation represent the core source of emission. I put next to that land use, because actually a lot of the land use, more than 50% of land use, is actually related emissions. It is caused by agriculture. And a lot of that by what actually the agriculture related to providing feed for the animal sector. And then finally, there is a crop production in which rice cultivation is, for instance, one of the big source of emission, as well as the use of fertilizer. Now, this is actually what makes specific the sector of agriculture. It's not only about climate, about greenhouse gas. There is also agriculture is responsible for trespassing some of the, what we call the other environments or planetary boundaries. So the first line of this graph is actually climate, so greenhouse gas. But next to that, you see all the other components that actually planets where we have finite boundaries and a bit of the reality check of where we stand. Now, each of these bars represents where we are versus the yellow line and the red line, which are, the limits of the planets. And you see that the blue part of that is the share of agriculture. And so what you basically see is agriculture is responsible not just about greenhouse gas emission, but also some of the, trespassing some of the other boundaries like biodiversity, freshwater use, or the cycle for phosphorus and nitrogen. Now that we basically understand the role of agriculture, so what was the findings or the impact of COP30? Well, actually, at the end, there was, while people recognize the role of agriculture, there is actually very little that was actually recognized in the final declaration. There is, if you basically take the global multi-RAO, so the global efforts, so the final text that was concluding the COP30, there is actually not a single reference to agriculture and food, right? So this is not something that has been actually a priority in this final, let's say, agreement. But that being said, why there was actually no specific outcome delivered from this formal negotiation process? There was actually a couple of initiatives that actually were, more voluntary-based initiatives that were actually quite interesting. So, for instance, there was like the RISE, the Resilient Agriculture Investment for Net Zero Land Degradation, that was actually trying to put together some of those limits that are on this slide, right? Some of the putting together biodiversity, land degradation, prosperity, and food security. There was, for instance, also a tropical forest fund, a forever fund, that is so far the largest forest finance mechanism that was created, Brazil-based, and that was actually kind of giving a bit of a subsidy for standing tropical forests. And there is also a Belém Declaration for Fertilizer that is a UK Brazil-based initiative to promote the use of the development, the production, and the use of clean fertilizer. Now, this absence of agreement was, as I said, compensated by some of these voluntary initiatives. If we basically look at some of the curve of scenarios for global emission, clearly they will not lead us to the Paris Agreement, right? They are not putting us on track, right, in terms of the speed, pace, and magnitude. But at least it gives a signal to the markets, it gives a signal to some of the regulators of what can be done. And it's largely driven by stakeholders of the industry. Now, the reason why we see some of those initiatives possible is, I'm trying to go one slide back, but it doesn't work. But anyway, the reason why we see some of this initiative being successful is actually because more than 50% of this of the initiative can actually be ROI positive. So you decrease the cost of food if you implement those initiatives. Now there is, to complete the picture and to complete what we need to do for agriculture, you basically have some other initiative that makes the food more expensive, but a lot of the things is based on existing technologies that can actually be beneficial for food production. Now, so the real challenge is therefore different, right? Because the technology exists. This is not about a sector where we need a lot of more innovation, more new invention for making agriculture sustainable, but it's about implementation. And it's linked to the very nature of the world of agriculture. It is fragmented and it's conservative. But put yourself in the shoes of a farmer, right? You make one decision a year and you literally bet your farm and the livelihood of your family when you make a decision. So the fact that levers exist and they are actually making food more affordable is not is not enough to actually make them implemented at large scale. You need actually to have some mechanism that share the risk or supports the transition periods until those positive ROI comes to bear. This is what we need to work on to make sure that we actually get on the right trajectory for agriculture.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nicholas Dennis. That was a crucial reminder that agriculture is not just a challenge to be managed, but a significant part of the climate solution. And now let's shift to our second round. We will explore Asia's challenges and strategic recommendations, especially for Thailand. So I would like to ask all three panelists, looking across Asia, what do you see as the most pressing challenges and the most compelling opportunities shaping the sustainability transition? And given this landscape, what single strategic priority should Thailand be focusing on to remain competitive in a low carbon economy? Dr. Praveen, please.
Thanks, Lisa. So look, I've got 3 slides to basically talk a bit about the journey that Thailand's on. Now, the first slide is a bit generic, just to talk about what every economy is grappling with when it comes to clean tech and grey tech. So on the y-axis here is the cost per unit, and on the right-hand side is the time it takes. So these are illustrative, generic, but you will see that the green line is clean tech and the brown line or the grey line is grey tech, right? And now what I want to show here is that ideally what you want is over time the 2 lines to have an inflection point. And this involves intervention. What I mean by that is, if you're looking at specifically the green line, you have government intervention in the terms of policies. We heard a lot about this in Chris's presentation as well, and the Honorable PM also spoke about it, the Honorable Deputy PM spoke about it earlier as well. Government intervention policies are so important. You had the IRA in the US. Singapore, for example, through its Marine Port Authority is also implementing bunkering policies. So that is the first thing that brings that green line down. You learn by doing. Efficiencies come in, and over time there's economies of scale that help in bringing that green line down. Now, at the same time, you want the gray line to go up as well. And how does that happen is you start phasing out subsidies that exist in fossil fuels. So you kind of make people get de-addicted from subsidies. You have carbon price, which comes in, which Wayne alluded to as well. Carbon price is so important. And the third thing is about looking at the descaling of economies. And what I mean by that is, if you look at something like a sustainable aviation fuel, now today you produce a lot of jet fuel, and that jet fuel gets blended into to produce sustainable aviation fuel. But over time, what we are talking about is that addiction towards gasoline and diesel is going to come out. Now, as a refiner, you cannot keep producing jet fuel for SAF without producing petrol and diesel. So this is something which countries will have to look at, economies will have to look at, and they'll have to manage that pathway. Now with that, I want to specifically get into 2 slides on Thailand. Now the first part is on power. Now we heard a lot about power sector, decarbonization of power sector, and how everyone looks at. On the left-hand side is your levelized cost of your LCOE by technology, basically in dollar per megawatt hour. And then on the right-hand side is your generation by technology. The good news is that Thailand's doing everything right to decarbonize its power sector. So that's great. And if you look at this chart, it's very encouraging what's going on with Thailand. With the focus on solar, with the focus on renewables, you see these cost curves come down, which was essentially what I was alluding to in my slide earlier, where the green line comes down. The bigger challenge that Thailand faces is in the industrial sector decarbonization. Now, on the left-hand side is the carbon tax, and I have deliberately put there the EU carbon price versus what the Thailand carbon price is, because the EU carbon price is very limiting. It's basically a very high price. It's a ceiling price, and because of that, of course, you will see things happen in the EU a lot quicker. With Thailand, the challenge that Thailand faces is that it needs to introduce a carbon tax in a phased manner where it makes it, the energy trilemma, which we call about, right? Which is sustainability, affordability, and at the same time, access to energy. All of that needs to be handled. So, I mean, my short-term answer to that question would be that Thailand needs to focus more on power and transport as decarbonization, and industry is something that it can tackle over a longer period of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Praveen Kumar. And now let's hear from Mr. Wayne Tan.
Thanks, Lisa. So, sorry. Just a second. So, I think one of the grand challenges for Asia, and that includes Thailand, is how can we create a system that can sustainably meet the ever-growing demand for energy and for mobility, while at the same time optimizing and lowering costs, as well as any any potentially negative impacts on the environment and the climate at large. And before I kind of jump into some thoughts about that question that I just raised to myself, I just want to share some key findings with you with regards to the levelized cost of electricity production. So this chart here actually shows the levelized cost of electricity produced by different technologies, or what we call the LCOE. And I'll just highlight some key observations from this chart. So in 2009, the LCOE of solar was actually above $400 per megawatt hour. Fast forward to 2024, it actually fell below $50 per megawatt hour, around the same level as onshore wind. But the more critical observation here as well is that the LCOE of solar and onshore wind is actually lower than coal and CCGT, which is essentially natural gas. Now, if you look closer into the more recent timeframes, you can see that the levelized cost of energy storage or battery storage, as well as offshore wind, is actually trending lower. And while it's still higher than fossil fuel-based power generation, the gap is closing very fast. So that's to say that renewables, depending on which technology you're talking about, is more cost competitive, if not very close to being cost competitive as compared to fossil-based power generation, which leads us to our finding that renewables is actually the cheapest source to meet new demand almost everywhere in the world. For almost every country in the world, renewables tends to be the cheapest way to meet incremental power demand. And this observation is the same for Thailand, just that for Thailand, our finding is that solar is the lowest cost option to meet any new demand for energy, which brings me to some very quick conclusions here. The first is to simply electrify wherever you can, so that more segments of the economy can benefit from the lowering cost of renewable power generation. However, with that being said, we have to ensure that there are no bottlenecks in the infrastructure. Things like grid capacity and whatnot has to be considered and has to be expanded in tandem with the growing electrification. The second thing is that while electrification of like transport, for example, like road transport is great and should be pursued, we think that investments in mass public transit systems is actually critical for most urban cities in Asia and including in Thailand. It is by far the most cost-efficient, emissions-efficient way to transport large groups of people from one place to the other. And when people have access to affordable and convenient transport, we lead to productivity gains, right? And the productivity gains can be realized and stacked up over a long period of time. The third is perhaps a little bit more specific to the clean power auctions in Thailand. We think that pursuing more price competitive auctions instead of just volume competitive auctions will actually lead to better price discovery, and which will in turn lower the amount of power subsidies needed under the feed-in tariff system. So that's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rin Tan. And finally, from the agriculture and food system perspective, Mr. Nicholas Dennis.
So let's be clear about one thing. So there won't be any sustainable path for agriculture if we don't maintain food security, right? Because every government knows that, no food security brings people on the street. And so there is no talk about sustainability without that. So we need to then think about, okay, what does that mean for the global land use equation? And globally, our perspective is when we did some research on this, we might actually, by 2030, which looks far away, but it's not, because it's 5 decisions away for farmers, because a farmer makes a decision a year. We might actually be short globally of a cropland size of Brazil. So it's massive. Now, if we look at Asia, situation is the same, right? We basically see that there is the food system growth trajectory is actually flattening, like in many other parts of the globe. At the same time, demand is rising, and we have compounding effect of geopolitics. If you take one by one those things, so climate change, as I said initially, right, is already taking a toll on agriculture. It's not just about lack of water in some place of the world, but it's also the level of heat, the level of drought that you get, that has actually an impact on supply. Demand is actually rising, not just because of the sheer growth of population, but also because of wealth of people, right? As people get more means, they actually consume more protein, and protein is the biggest source of emissions in agriculture. And then we have a compounding impact of geopolitics. Making efficient trade was actually an important lever for food security, and actually, we see less and less of that. So what should Thailand do? For me, there is actually 2 priorities. So first, reflect on the land use equation. You need to think, if I simplify the land use equation issue, you need to think about 3 roles of land. One is to provide food security. So in Thailand, it's actually a lot about rice. 2, there is actually land that we use for high-value crops, which are important because it's actually fueling some of the wealth of the country and of the farmers. And 3, we need to think about land for nature-based solution, capturing carbon with forest, reforestation, for instance. So first element is think about the land use equation. The second element is to think about productivity. And here comes a challenge, right? Because as I showed, there is a lot of levers to bring productivity up and to make agriculture more sustainable, but it spreads across, in Thailand, millions of farmers. If you take rice, for instance, there are 4 million of farmers that basically cultivate rice, and it's an important base of the sustainability of the household. But Thailand is actually, compared to its peers, one of the lowest productivity country for rice production, which basically means that it is actually, because of the rice is emitting methane, Thailand is actually, one of the largest emitting countries when it comes to rice production. So this is important, and the technology exists. But as I said earlier, because of the fragmentation, because of the risks that farmers need to bear, you need to actually put some mechanism in place to incentivize the adoption, to manage the risk, to provide crop insurance, to provide mechanisms that sustain the adoption. But as I said, solution exists, and so land use and crop productivity should be, from my perspective, the two priorities for Thailand for agriculture.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nicholas Dennis. Thank you to our three esteemed panelists. Today we've moved from the high-level ambition gaps from COP30 to grounded reality of battery costs and the future of our soil. It is clear that the transition is quite complex, but as we've heard from all the panelists, the economic and technological engines are already humming, right? Already on its way. So the big picture today is that the road to net zero is being paved by pragmatic innovation and strategic investment, whether it's through the clean power, smarter transport, or sustainable rice paddies. The future of Thailand and Asia depends on our ability to bridge these sectors together. And today, on behalf of our organizers, PTT Group would like to sincerely thank our panelists, Dr. Praveen Kumar, Senior Director, Asia Pacific, S&P Global Energy, Mr. Wayne Tan, Global Head of Oil Markets, Bloomberg NEF, and also Mr. Nicholas Dennis, Partner, Brussels, and Lead, Global Agriculture Investing. Please give them a big round of applause. ขอเสียงปรบมือด้วยนะคะ Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your time, your contribution. And thank you to all guests, the audience, for joining us as well. And for this session, I'm Elizabeth Sadler, Lina Anushai. I've been your moderator. Thank you so much. And now let's pass this back to Kunjun, our host.
ขอบพระคุณมากค่ะขอเสียงปรบมือดังอีกครั้งหนึ่งนะคะให้กับทุกท่านบนเวทีค่ะ